And here we are once again, the start of another month, the end of another month of March 2022. This is a recap time. Now, before I get into the additional commentary on the books that were reviewed on this channel, I do want to highlight one thing, and that this is a value for value podcast. So I do this podcast with the expectation that I'm providing value for you, the listener, also viewer at home, because we put this both on the YouTube as a video format and then also on the podcasting platforms as an audio only one as well. And I put in a lot of time, a lot of effort into these things, and this podcast cannot continue without this video series also cannot continue without your help. So there are many ways to do this: time, talent, or treasure. You could take the time to share this with another friend, spread the word out. It does help having more viewers listening and having nice things being said about it as well. Talent, you could do a little piece of Excel work for me, or you could look at this and say, your videography is not so great. If you put the light here, this would produce a better effect, things like that. And then, of course, treasure. This is helping to fund, I suppose, the podcast. So for whatever value you got from listening to the probably 15, 20 minutes that this episode will last, how much do you value that? Is it worth $1? Is it worth $10? Is it worth $100? You know, whatever you choose to send value is whatever you decide. And I suppose I'm just emphasizing this right now because the core aspect of value for value is being able to continue doing this long term, so I don't have to resort to something I I won't resort to, which is advertising. I respect my time and I respect your time too much to force something in front of your face that I don't believe in. And so if it ever gets to the point where I have to make the decision of either to continue the podcast or put advertising in, I'm going to discontinue the podcast. So just letting you know that straight up at the front, this is all done through the help of Podcasting 2.0. This is now a Podcasting 2.0 certified show because I have the shirt to match with it as well. And so if you do want to help support financially the show, you can go to newpodcastapps.com, choose one of the ones with value. And I also do chapter art, images, all of these sorts of things. I don't really highlight this enough on here. And so because when we're doing the book reviews, I really want that to be a sort of standalone piece that you can go in, get the most value out of, and there's not too much fluffing around. With these recap ones and me adding additional explanations, thoughts, and things like that, it's more open to interpretation. It's more a better suited format, I should say, for that. So just letting you know that. And I also do put chapter art and images, as you'll be seeing and on your screens, both when you're watching the video and also in a decent podcast app, which has the chapter images. One I would recommend is Fountain. I've found that quite useful, and it has nice big chapter images, so you can see everything that is going on. I think that'll be a good place to end that little section, and then we'll go on to now the book recap. So the first one that really jumped out at me, my favorite of the month, was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or The One That Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Can't remember. And this was a book that I'd heard a lot about before, and funnily enough, I'd never heard the actual story of it. I had no idea what to expect coming in. I didn't know it was going to be about a mental hospital. I didn't know it was going to talk about the themes that it did. All I knew was that I'd heard this was a good book. And there was a couple of things that I mentioned in that book review, but didn't get particularly onto because I felt it would probably take too long, to be honest. And so I decided to save them for here. And so a couple of notes I was asking was, does the Combine matter if its presence is not noticed by your consciousness? I.e., there was this force that appeared that Chief Bromden noticed, which was, it's sort of like a crushing, overwhelming societal stigma is sort of how I like to put it, a power that wanted to meld and mold everyone into a sort of defined format. It wanted to eliminate the chaos that was in the world and make it more ordered and neat, which is, not necessarily a bad thing on its own, but when applied to individuals, I think that's where the the book was really trying to get at. This was written, of course, in a very special time in history when the US government was being very restrictive on its citizens, I would say, and trying to meld and force people to, don't take drugs. You need to be patriotic, join the war effort. You need to work hard for your country, get a 9 to 5. We're all in this together, sort of thing. And to do this, it would be trying to meld people into like the perfect worker. You fit into this box and you do this thing. You do fit into this box and you do this thing. And so a lot of people seem to be getting left behind. And one of the questions with all of that, I guess, was, does it matter if you don't notice it? So in essence, the question I'm asking, is it okay to be a sheep in life? Is it okay to just be blissfully unaware? Ignorance is bliss, that sort of mentality. And I think you could make an argument for that. And I think you could almost make an argument for noticing the combine but almost deceiving yourself into thinking that it doesn't exist. And I say this because what's a good life? What is it to live a good life? And there are some things in life which you just can't change. Like no matter what you want to do, you're not going to be able to change the height that you were born at, unless you do something silly like breaking your shins and implanting a little knob in the middle of your broken shins and then the bones healing over that. You could do that, but that's really dumb. And so I think there's some things in life which you just can't change. And I would almost argue that there is this thing that happens when humans get together in groups and whatnot, and there is a force that is generated from this. It's not necessarily malevolent. It's not necessarily dictated by a person at the top saying we should force everyone to behave like this. And if you take drugs, you'll get wild thoughts that are outside the normal thing, and you might behave differently. And so I was sort of thinking, like, Chief Bromden was a really smart guy, from what you could tell in the book. He was very observant. He sort of did the smart thing, which was keep his mouth shut and behave like a dumb deaf mute. Even though he had this rich inner world going on. And this allowed him to survive in this place longer than anyone else, because he was one of the longest people who was staying in there. And so I was just thinking, what if he had taken the option of fooling himself into not thinking that this thing existed, or fighting back in a different way, fighting back in the sense of almost like he did, I guess, in a sense, which was behaving one way to get on in the world, but still having this rich inner life. I don't know. It was just making me think that just because something is there, there could be a good case for saying, like, if it's not noticed by your consciousness, is it really there? Does it even really matter? Sort of getting to the question of, if every human died, would the universe still exist? You would still say probably yes, like, oh, the earth is still there. It's still, it's not like the sun's going to go away just because I go away, but there is something about the observation is also important to the thing itself. I don't know, kind of rambling a bit, to be honest, but that was one thing. Another was, what is it, what is this force, and, what is Nurse Ratched's purpose, for example? So if we're looking at her in specific, why was she so, why was she the personification of this, of the combine of this force trying to meld people into a narrow box where every movement could be controlled? And I didn't get the feeling that she loved the power of, like, it wasn't like she was getting good feelings from being able to dictate arbitrarily what, the inmates or what the mental patients could do or couldn't do. I didn't feel like it was the normal association which you would maybe get from a dictator, which is, the love of power, or this overwhelming joy, or like good feelings somehow being mixed in, because it seemed like she was pretty bland throughout. It seemed like she didn't really have good feelings per se. And I would say like there really was no purpose. That it simply is. So it's not like the force is doing it for an ulterior reason. It's just doing it because it is. And it's sort of like asking, what is gravity's purpose? What is the purpose of gravity? What are its intentions? And it's like, that's a dumb question, because there is no real purpose. That's just something it's a thing that happens. It's a law of the universe. And you don't need to go further than that, because there is no intention behind it. I would also say the same thing about the Combine. It's not like the Combine is trying to achieve something for another purpose. It's just doing something because it is. So even though it can be made up of individual humans, and Nurse Ratched would be one of these, it's sort of like a collective thing that behaves on its own. So that's just one of the things I took from the book and found intriguing, and that's why I gave it a 7.5 out of 10 and quite enjoyed it. In addition to the other sort of themes that were being carried on with regards to, let me bring up my little book here, with regards to the institutions, the squashing of people, the characters themselves. I really did quite enjoy that book. The next one was Dubliners, which I gave a 4 out of 10. So this was James Joyce. Oh, and the previous book was by Ken Kesey. And I got to say, there wasn't much that really jumped out at me from this book. A collection of short stories, all related to Dublin. It sounded like a city, and he wrote it with the purpose of showing that every city can somewhat be alike, that it was a universal human, I suppose, experience, which is fine, a cool observation. But the problem with it is the normal everyday human life is kind of boring. He was just talking about like going to a party, or a guy who's unsatisfied with his job and feels neglected, and a lady who a guy who had an experience with a lady. He was kind of like shy and withdrawn. She made too overt a physical gesture to him or something like that, and he got scared off. It's all like these random little interactions that are part of day-to-day life. There was nothing I really took out of this as being like, wow, that's amazing. Probably the only thing was I learnt a new word, which is saturnine. Saturnine, I believe that's how you say it, which is a word for gloomy. So there you go. That was probably the only thing I really took out of this book, and I'm not going to really remember it in the future. I still do want to try out Ulysses, though, by James Joyce. That's the main book I've heard is his sort of masterpiece. I've read this one now. I've read The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, and I think neither of those really stood out at me. So I'll give it one more shot with Ulysses, and if that doesn't if that isn't interesting, I'm not sure I'll read much more James Joyce in the future. The other one that I read was La Casa Verde, which is The Greenhouse by Mario Vargas Llosa. So this is one of the Spanish books I collected a fair while ago, and I gave it a good shot. I tried my best. I shouldn't say that, actually. I didn't try my best. The way I read it was kind of silly, and over an extended period in Spanish for an experimental novel was not the way to go to try and experience it. That being said, I have a feeling even if I read it in the English version, I probably wouldn't have enjoyed it, because I did give it enough time for it to do something for me, to really jump out at me, and it just purely didn't. There was particularly the Latin American boom period, which is when this was written, was a period where a lot of South American artists were experimenting with new forms of writing. So a couple of other books I've covered with relation to this period were by Carlos Fuentes. I think I covered one of his books. Jorge Luis Borges, the famous Colombian, Gabo. Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So these are books like Cien Años de Soledad, things like that. And there was these sections where he would just fill the page. There would be no paragraphs, no line spacings, no nothing. you couldn't tell who was writing it. Was it a narration? Was it like an internal monologue? Was it a description of the scenery of what was it was just really hard to understand. So yeah, not my favorite book. I would say. So I ended up giving that a 2.5 out of 10. I can't particularly recommend it, to be honest. The last one was Steve Jobs, which was written by Walter Isaacson. Juan covered this book, so I didn't read it myself, but I did listen to the book review. And this is one of the few that I would say I'm really glad that Juan did a review of. And I was really appreciative of having this review available because, as he mentioned and showed, it's a thick book, 500 and something pages. And whilst I am intrigued about Steve Jobs just because of the impact he's had on this world, I'm really glad I didn't have to read it because I'm not a fan of arseholes. I'm really not a fan of arseholes. And he, from the book review, it sounded like he was a real big arsehole. And there's just something in me which doesn't, it makes me angry hearing about people who mistreat other people like that. And even if they're doing it for an amazing purpose, for creating this amazing product, the iPhone and whatnot, and one of the biggest companies ever in Apple, I still was just like, nah, fuck that guy. Fuck that dude. I couldn't be asked. So I'm really glad Juan did it. Read the review, probably more interesting for him because he does product things himself, and just honestly the whole Apple saga just doesn't really capture my interest. So glad that Juan read it, and glad it wasn't me, and he gave that a 7 out of 10. I'm going to jump now onto the Boostergram Lounge. So I talked a little bit before about how you can help support the podcast, and we have a bit of support here through Peter predominantly, only Peter actually. So there's a couple of messages that he sent through. The first one was all of these were sent through Fountain. And the first one, 2,200 Satoshis, thank you, Peter, was the Irish are some of my favorite drunks. Dubliners, that was talking about Dubliners by James Joyce. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I don't think I have a favorite drunk per se. I wouldn't say that there is one species of race or country or gender or mix or anything that is my favorite drunk. I think I just enjoy individuals. So individuals probably. And even then, I don't hang enough around really drunk people enough to be able to comment. I'm glad that the Irish are your favorite. And, that was one of the things I took out of the book. If you go to Dublin, like there's going to be a lot of drinking going on. So that's something to think about. A question. So this is 1,222 sats. And he asked, do you pick books with a show review in mind, or would you read these particular books anyway if there was no podcast involved? I would say for the most part, I would read these books anyway. I'm not, for example, going through old book reviews and seeing which ones were the most popular and then reading more books like that. I do know just offhand that the most popular ones have been the Gulag Archipelago, Ordinary Men, and then I suppose more classic ones would probably be up there in terms of the most popular ones that I've read. But I don't do that, and the only, it's really hard to sometimes look at things and say, oh yeah, this is the motivation, and if this wasn't here, I would act exactly the same. No, probably not true, but I would say for the most part, the books I take are just ones that I've heard about in casual conversations on podcasts, or someone's recommended it to me. A couple of these have been because an audience member has suggested it or said that they enjoy it, things like this. But the only time I've really picked books for the purpose of doing it for the podcast was when I was behind in my reading schedule and I needed a thin book to get through. So there was a couple of times when, for example, I read The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. There was a book review, The Bell Jar. I'd previously read that book and it was fairly short, and so I just sort of skimmed it again to reassociate myself with the book, and then did a review on that. So those have been the only times that I've really done that. But by and large, for the most part, I just go all over the place. And so I think you can sort of see that. Like, it's not like I have a particular theme that I'm concentrating on or anything like that. The only difference I would maybe add to that is my reading schedule compared to last year is done as significantly lessened. So back then I was doing 2 book reviews a week. So that whole year I probably read close to 80 something, maybe even 90 something. This year I'll probably be closer to like 40 something. So I'm reading about half as much. And that, does that play a part on it? No, not particularly. I would say my motivations for doing these reviews are just because I like doing them. And the books that I pick are for myself, I guess. But I will also review ones if there is an interest in hearing what my opinion on that book is. So for the most part, no. I would say 90% it's not related to this, maybe even 95%. The last one is, of all things I've lost, I miss my mind the most. And that was a quote by Ozzy Osbourne for the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 2,178 sats. Of all the things I've lost, I miss my mind the most. It's a nice quote. I'd probably have to think about that for a bit. And particularly in the context of Ozzy Osbourne, who seems like a pretty wild character. But yes, it's a good book to examine the craziness, I guess, in essence. But the funny thing is, most of the people in the book seem really sane. It seemed like a really sane book for considering it was set in a mental hospital. So the last thing, there was one other aspect I wanted to bring up, which was a comment. And so this is sort of how you can also be helpful in terms of time or talent. And this was a comment left by M76Q5, who is a pretty regular listener to this channel and also leaves some very nice comments on the YouTube. And I wanted to bring this one up because this is also, I think, a good way of interacting with the show and helping out almost. So they say, good review. And so this is talking about the Ken Kesey book, The One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's one of my favorite books, along with 1984. This guy gets it. Yes, my favorite book as well. And I've read it 3 times. The other book by Kesey is nearly unreadable. Okay, good knowledge. I don't particularly need to do that then. I think that many of the patients are not that mentally off to emphasize the role of power and control, obviously in society in general. Everyone gets the combine sooner or later. Oddly, I've known many people from Eastern Europe who think the novel is one of the greatest and most accurate books/novels ever written. That is pretty fascinating info. I wonder if that's because, like I was talking about with the consciousness aspect, they might see it's more in their face because of the governments that they've had, the absurdity or the molding, the power is like really in their face. And so if you look at some of the previous governments that they've had in the USSR and the sort of semi-dictators/dictators that they've had there, all the wartime stuff, all of those sorts of rules and restrictions are maybe a bit more in their face. And so they have this understanding more of what the combine is rather than, let's just say, take me as an Australian, where my government, although annoying with regulations and things like that, it really isn't in my face and it's not super day-to-day life. So that's an interesting little aspect right there. As a bit of trivia, Kesey had trouble writing the book until he took mescaline. Then under the influence of that drug, the character of Chief Bromden came to him and he could write the book. It is very much a book of its time as well as a great novel. Thank you for that comment, M7. That's very helpful, and there's a lot of useful little tidbits in there which I wouldn't have known about unless he'd written it in. So if you're watching the YouTube right now, leave me a little comment, and if you're listening to it via the audio, leave me a boostergram. So that's a way you can interact with the show and give me a little bit of content as well. So thank you very much. The last one is now what is coming up for April of 2022. Well, I've got a bunch of books here with me. I had promised last time, I believe, that I would be doing Reasons and Persons by Derek Parfit. If you can see where my book tag is, I'm only, I'd say, a quarter of the way through it. It's pretty thick, and it's not light reading, and my reading schedule has been slightly lessened of late, so I haven't been going through books as quickly. But I will read it and I will review it, because I do find it it's sort of like a book that I wish that I had. I was moaning about, oh man, I want a philosophy book that really gets deep into things and starts, is really careful with its words and examines things as deep as it can. And this one is doing that. And now I have some thoughts on, okay, did I really want that, for example? Another one I've got is another book written in Spanish. This is Jorge Luis Borges, El aprendizaje del escritor, which is, I guess, like the learning, the apprenticeship of a writer. So that one is sort of like his examination of his own works and how a writer should view things and why he wrote in certain ways. I've got Medea, and other plays. I'm not really sure how you pronounce that, but that's by Euripides. And so that is a Greek classic of work. And then Juan is also going to be doing Rogue State, I believe, by William Blum, whose name he can never remember. So those are a couple of things that you can expect for this next month, and maybe an additional one or a switch out for Reasons and Persons, because I'm not confident I will finish that one. And that is it, I believe, for this recap. Thank you, everyone, for joining me to this point. I'll emphasize just right again at the end here, there's a Value for Value podcast, and all the help and participation that you can do to make this podcast better. And if you have suggestions for how to make this podcast better, please just message in any of the available platforms. We leave links on every single episode that is put out. So all you would have to do is go to any single one of them, write something, get in contact with me and say, I'd prefer it if you did this, or here's a suggestion, or anything like that. It really would help me out. It really would help me out. And so that is it for today for the March 2022 recap. Thank you for joining me to this point, and I really do hope you have a fantastic day wherever you are in the world. Current out.